Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Who would have thought 13 Russians, 3 entities, and some cash could impact an American presidential election? This is where Russiagate stands today. Also, more twists and turns in the messy conflict known as Syria. Cross-talking those 13 Russians, I'm joined by my guest, Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. We also have Alexander Mikiris. He is a writer on legal affairs as well as editor-in-chief of theduran.com. And we have Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Sputnik International. As always, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's go to those 13 Russians, 3 entities, and all that cash. Maybe not so much cash. Alexander, you've been writing about it. From a legal perspective, give us your major takeaways.
Right, well, the first point to say is that, of course, none of these people are going to be tried. So Mr. Mueller has prepared a very complicated, portentously worded indictment, which is never going to be tested
because there is no extradition law.
There's no extradition law. The Russians are not going to extradite these people. They're going to stay in Russia. So he doesn't have to prove any of the things that he has said. What seems to have happened is that some of these people have engaged in trolling on the internet, and they've done things which, let's be straightforward, are ugly things. Mr. Mueller,
but not unheard of.
Not unheard of,
and not just specifically to Russia.
And
okay?
Not specific to Russia
nothing
at
new
all.
here.
Nothing new here at all. I mean, anybody who goes on the internet comes across trolls. What Mr. Mueller has done is he wants to prove that there is this vast, intricate, dangerous conspiracy. He's put all this together. He's labelled the internet agency in St. Petersburg as responsible, and he's trawled around for various laws that he can stick offences against these people on.
Essentially what this was, if you read the indictment, Mark, let me go to you, this was a commercial marketing is what it was, and even the indictment itself admits that it was pro-anti-Trump, pro-anti-Hillary Clinton, and everything in between. I mean, there's no specific political tilt to it.
There's no connections at all. There's not even any connections between this supposed company, which is run by a guy who's known as Putin's chef because he ran a catering business before
but that isn't even true.
That catering business is for Russian school children in Moscow. It's not about Putin, you know. It was just the liberal media in Russia that labeled him that.
And there's no connections at all to the Russian government. There's no connections at all to the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, or any of the other 4 people on completely unrelated and spurious charges that Mueller has charged any of the other 4 people who have been indicted on tax charges or anything else.
So we have 4 indictments before this. Now we have these indictments of 13 individuals
that will never be tried.
and 3 entities, and none of them have any connection with the Russian government,
Trump, or with any
or the Trump campaign, right?
Trump campaign, or any of the collusion claims.
It's enough that they were Russians, they were alive in 2016, and they posted something on Facebook that Americans could see.
Yes.
It doesn't matter that 95% of the European media was very pro-Hillary and anti-Trump during the campaign, and Americans could read millions of pages of their stuff during their campaign. That's not important. What is important is that these 13 Russians did it. Well, let me make this hilarious quote from Leonid Bershitsky. He is a writer.
Bloomberg.
He is a writer for Bloomberg. He used to be a liberal Russian journalist. Now he lives abroad. He writes about Russia just like Masha Gessen. The difference is that he knows a thing or two about Russian history and literature, unlike Masha Gessen. So here's what he wrote. I'm actually surprised. I haven't been indicted. I'm Russian. I was in the US in 2016, and I published columns critical of both Clinton and Trump without registering as a Russian agent.
Okay, that goes to my next point, Alexander. Given what we just heard from Dima, then Christopher Steele should be indicted as well. He's a foreigner. He wasn't registered as a foreign agent. He didn't report to the Federal Election Commission about what he was doing. I mean, this is a glaring... And he lied, okay?
We've just got a confession. According to the actual terms of the indictment, Dmitry Babbage is the unnamed 14th Russian troll.
Yes, because people in the United States...
If you read the indictment, that could be very possible.
Well, there could be millions.
Let me go back to the Christopher Steele, because I think it's really important.
The question's been answered. I mean, all the things that people have been indicted for, Christopher Steele has done. He has lied to the FBI. He has interfered in the US election. He has done so secretly. He has been phoning up newspapers. He has been publishing information in a dossier that cannot be verified. He hasn't registered as any kind of foreign agent. And so why hasn't he been indicted? Why is there this resistance on the part of the Justice Department to indict him?
This is probably what I find most puzzling of all, Alexander, is the Trump's own DOJ and FBI. Maybe it's slightly different in a situation with the FBI. With the DOJ, why isn't it moving there? That is a mystery to me.
Because it's not Trump's.
Yes.
I mean,
well, that answers the
Trump
question.
Doesn't have, I mean, we've talked about it plenty of times in this before. Trump has no power of his own administration. He's certainly given away foreign and military policy. His own Justice Department is pursuing him, and you know, this cabal of generals, McMaster, Mattis, McMasters, and Kelly keeps him in a little playpen. And you know, his only real power is tweeting, and evidently he's not allowed to do that whenever he wants as well. So.
Well, I mean, it's an attempt to use 19th century legislation to 21st century's realities. I mean, in the 19th century, maybe it was illegal to bring pamphlets in favor of one of the candidates during the campaign. Now we live in an electronically interconnected world. If I want my American friends to read my opinion on Trump or on Hillary, I just post it on the internet. I post it on
because Facebook doesn't know, and Twitter doesn't know borders.
Absolutely.
That now makes you a criminal.
Exactly, but it makes me a criminal in the eyes of Mr. Mueller, right?
Okay, well, let's talk about election meddling. A couple of days ago on the Laura Ingraham program, the former head of the CIA, James Woolsey, was on, and she asked a few questions about his reaction to the indictments, and then she talked about election meddling, but American election meddling abroad. Let's take a look.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections,
only for a very good cause.
Can you do that to them?
For a good
Ladies
cause.
and gentlemen, our good viewers, that was the former head of the CIA. Who wants to go first? Go ahead,
Well,
Dina.
James Woolsey, let me speak about him in the way Western media speaks about Russia.
He's the former head of the CIA.
Former head of the CIA, former CIA colonel, you know, if we use the language that they use about Mr. Putin.
He's not a colonel.
Okay, maybe a general. A former head of the Freedom House after that, who said in the early 2000s, Mr. Bashar al-Assad, Mr. Mubarak, we are coming after you. Which was actually true, you know. And he's not meddling, he's not interfering in other countries' elections. You know, just somehow the United States helped some Nazis come to power in Ukraine.
I think he famously said
2014.
that Ukraine was the crown jewel. I mean, looking for forced regime, illegal change there. Alexander, react to that because, you know, they both chuckled, okay? I mean, for me, that's a jaw-dropping. You know, you're accusing a foreign country, and a very powerful one, Russia, of doing something against your country without any evidence whatsoever beyond a troll farm, okay? And there is ample evidence, mountains of evidence, the United States meddles in elections. It has for decades. And it's probably doing so exactly right now.
Well, indeed. When I was in Greece in 1968, when there was a coup, he refers to Greece. I was actually taken prisoner at the age of 7 by the people who carried out the US-backed coup. and the house where we used to live was taken over by a family from the US Embassy. So it's not actually such a light-hearted or funny thing.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, no, I mean, if you look at the entire segment, is that, you know, if the U.S. does it, it's okay.
Well,
if anybody else does it, it isn't okay. That's the double standard, Mark.
Okay, Peter, if you could bear with me a little bit. I think it's time for a little bit of literature
I know you're prepared. I know you're prepared.
All right, so this is about the projection from the U.S. onto other countries like Russia of what it does. The Guardian revealed U.S. spy operation that manipulates social media. This is from 2011. The U.S. military, the Pentagon, is developing software that it will let it secretly manipulate social media sites by using fake online personas to influence internet conversations and spread pro-American propaganda. And it specifically notes that the discovery that the U.S. military is doing this with fake online personalities, sock puppets, could also encourage other governments, private corporations, and government organizations to do the
also
same.
here, there was a program with on Twitter that does the same thing vis-a-vis Cuba.
Indeed, and bear in mind, this is the U.S. military. What we've just heard alleged. Yeah. There's no connection to the
Next
Russian
one, Mark. We have one more minute before we go to the break.
GHCQ, the British version of the National Security Agency, does the same thing. Overwhelming evidence. We have a database from Carnegie Mellon using the U.S. government's own data. They've meddled in other elections 81 times, only up to 2000, not counting coups and regime changes. And, of course,
the famous...
How can we forget this picture? Time magazine, Russia... the Americans openly helped Yeltsin in a rigged election keep power. Yanks to the rescue. They were quite proud about their meddling back then. They even made a movie, Spinning Boris, congratulating themselves
1996, don't forget about this date, you know. Well, I think it's just a classical case of double standards, you know.
But, you know, it's interesting. You're right, but they don't see it that way. They can't see this far away from their face when it comes to issues like this.
Well, you know, the problem is also with our elite. You know, the response of Russian elite is usually, you are using us in your internal policy struggle. Well, for a totalitarian ideology with global aspirations, which is now reigning in the United States, there is no difference between foreign and domestic policy. Your foreign policy is part of your domestic policy. So, you know, they were trying to remove Mr. Trump.
We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue with a discussion on those 13 Russians. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. All right, gentlemen, let's switch gears here. Let's go back to Syria. Let's go back to the Middle East. Last couple of days, we had Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Ankara trying to smooth some feathers. I mean, both countries realize that they're at a crisis point here. After a 3-hour meeting with the Turkish President Erdogan, there's the impression, at least, that some kind of agreement was made. I don't get that impression the way it was, what was released here. Mark, what was the point of the meeting, and what is the main bone of contention here? Because these are NATO allies, and they're going toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose in a country, Syria, where neither one of them should be. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this was obviously for Washington to hold Erdogan's hands, try to reassure him it's over their arming of the YPG on Turkish border.
The Kurds.
The Kurds, and owning a large chunk, basically claiming as of their own, of Syrian territory, again, much of it right on the Turkish and the Iraqi border. Turkey's extremely upset about this. There were these optics didn't do much, because even as Tillerson was arriving, there was the announcement that the Pentagon is going to be giving another $550 million this year to arm and otherwise support these forces that he's very upset about.
But there has to be a tipping point here, Dima. I mean, Erdogan is invested enormously in this operation here, Olive Branch, unbelievably, that's called Olive Branch.
Yeah, the invasion of Syria.
The invasion of Syria here. I mean, and the United States is not making it very, it's saying, the Pentagon is saying, it will stay in Syria indefinitely against international law here. Something has to go one way or another.
Well, what happened was that the United States indeed kind of provoked Turkey into moving in. That was said by our foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who said...
Because of the support of the Kurds.
Support of the Kurds and, you know, these border security forces that the Americans started talking about.
Didn't tell the Turks. Didn't tell the Turks.
Exactly.
Provoke or provided a pretext
and basically, I don't even understand why Mr. Tillerson is talking to Erdogan, because Erdogan has been saying the same things as Kim Jong-un about the United States in the last 2 weeks. He accused the United States of helping terrorists, you know. So you can see how desperately the U.S. is trying to preserve its relationship with Turkey.
And let's see, Alex, the background of this is that we have an upcoming meeting in Istanbul with Iran, Turkey, and Russia. It seems to me Erdogan is basically checking out the terrain here, okay? Because the United States is certainly not going to, is not cooperative, at least, in this regard when it comes to the Kurds. It seems to me it's patently obvious that the U.S. wants a statelet, it wants a partition, the Israelis want it, the Saudis are happy with it.
The Turks want it, their own partition.
And they want their own, and we have to look at the occupied territory where the U.S. has it. This is where the gas fields are for Syria. Again, no money for reconstruction. Okay, so, but Erdogan is looking at the horizon, and I think he's looking for, maybe he's going into the Grand Bazaar. Go ahead.
These are two illegal invasions of Syria by two NATO allies, which are working at the moment at cross purposes. They are both dangerous for Syria, and I think that is an important point to remember. As for Erdogan, he has to try and balance the fact that he is now in conflict with the United States. So he is now trying to get some kind of arrangement with the Russians and the Iranians to try and balance out the anger that the US has.
It's being proposed that the Turks and the Americans work together militarily when the Americans are embedded with the Kurds. I mean, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
This is the problem. But at the same time that he's trying to leverage the Russians against the Americans, he's trying to use the Americans to leverage against the Russians so that he can extract concessions in Syria.
And he can.
Which exactly.
His calculus may be right, because just a few days ago when the reports about the Turkish army using chemical weapons near Afrin appeared, what was the reaction from the spokesperson for the US-led coalition? The US coalition has no information on this. Well, before, whenever there was just a rumor about the Syrian government using chemical weapons, immediately there was an outburst.
They had a lot of rhetoric for something that never, ever happened.
And they didn't even send inspectors there. They were so sure that this information was correct. With Turkey, somehow, they prefer to be silent.
Well, the interesting thing, too, Mark, is that and we have to look at the internal dynamics of Turkey. Erdogan's perceived anti-American stance is very popular domestically for him. So this is, again, another part of the spectrum that he's playing.
He first of all, he accused the U.S. of a coup trying to overthrow his government. U.S.-backed Gulenists under the bed. Probably the only coup that I believe the U.S. hasn't been involved in recent time. But it's enormously popular with his Islamist base. And Erdogan's base is Islamist. On top of that, he's turned his country into basically the holiday resort for all of the jihadis across the world who have been debarking into Syria for the last 6 years. If he suddenly does an about-face, turns away from al-Qaeda, turns away from regime change in Syria, he's got to deal with them on his own soil as terrorists.
But he also has to deal with, Alex, is that, again, going back to this meeting with Istanbul with the Iranians, the Russians, and the Turks, is that what Erdogan is doing is wanting to make sure that he's part of some kind of peace process where two countries, Russia and Iran, can play a forceful role, an instrumental role, because the United States is the spoiler, okay? It's the spoiler country. It's not interested in any kind of conflict resolution. That's the other kind of gambit that he's playing.
It is the gambit, but he's also trying to use his deals with the Russians to extend his influence into Syria. He's now sending troops into Syria.
He's legitimizing his military occupation in Syria with the Astana Agreement.
He's sending troops deep into Idlib province. They're obstructing the Syrian
They're doing
military
joint
there.
patrols openly with Al-Qaeda.
That's
With Al-Qaeda.
that's the mecca of jihadism right now.
Exactly, and of course he's doing that using this these arrangements that he's made with the Russians and the Iranians to legitimize that. There is another side, because of course there's a Russian side. They say, well, we need the cooperation of Erdogan to try and stabilize
we haven't mentioned
the
one
situation.
important country. I mean, there's a lot of chatter,
Yes.
Dima,
Yes.
that the Israelis are looking for a real, meaningful, scary conflict with the Iranians, also with Hezbollah. Do you see this as a part of a puzzle piece right now? Because that would, for planners, for American planners in the Pentagon, it would be nice to have a foothold in Syria if an operation like that were to be pulled off.
I prefer to stay on the ground of facts. Let's just look at the facts. Israel has been firing missiles on the territory of a sovereign state in the condition of a foreign intervention at the civil war several times.
Over 100 times since 2011.
Exactly. The Iranians in Lebanon, their embassy was a victim of a huge terrorist act 3 years ago, and no one in the West even expressed condolences. Israel has been occupying Lebanon since 1982, and that was the reason why Hezbollah came into being. It had not existed before. And now Israel, which has been applauding, the foreign interventions in Syria, is concerned about its security and the increased influence of Iran near its border.
But they got a very cold message that the Syrians will start defending their airspace. To what degree that will be put into play, we don't know. I mean, it certainly sent a very powerful message. We don't know to what degree that the Russians or the Iranians were involved in that decision. I tend to think it was Assad saying, hey, this is my country, stop doing it. As Mark said, enough is enough.
But look, we had this media hype this week. Michael Morrow's dream has come true. The Western media reported, the former head of the CIA, who said things are going to be bad in Syria until we start to kill Russians.
He said we need to kill Russians and Iranians in Syria to make them pay a price for resisting our regime change. Now Russians have been killed.
What happened was that near these oil-rich areas of Syria, the Syrian government army had a clash with basically illegal armed formations on its territory.
There were no Syrian government army forces.
There were
local tribes,
supposedly Russians and Syrians. 5 Russians got killed. This is what the Russian foreign ministry.
They were contractors.
They were contractors.
Security contractors.
Okay, as if the United States doesn't use Academy, Blackwater, and other contractors. So the Western media tried to make out of it a huge revelation, like something that Putin wants to hide. If anyone in Syria...
What was that? I read it, Putin's pocket army or something like that?
Exactly, things like that.
Alex, one of the things is that, we keep tabs on in this program is what's going on in Ukraine, and unfortunately I think we're going to be talking a lot about Ukraine this year. Looking at Syria, looking at Ukraine, in its totality, it looks like American policy is just pure spite. It's their regime change in Ukraine didn't work out the way they wanted it because they lost Crimea. They have a frozen conflict that gets warm every once in a while and even hot. And then we have Syria where they lost again. And Yemen. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't call that mature foreign policy because none of it is in America's vested interest.
Well,
Go ahead.
It's foreign policy by anger. I think anger is perhaps stronger than spite, and I think there is an element of that and of smashing around. But it's also partly, I think, intended to show American power. Frustration. But there is an element. There is a certain element of calculation in which that if you withstand us, you will be hurt. And you see that a lot in Syria too.
Okay, Mark, for 40 seconds here. I want to go back to Erdogan and Tillerson. What's your gut feeling what deal was made or or the non-deal that was made?
Yeah, I don't think there was any deal made. Turkey's proposal that they would basically do a joint invasion of Syria,
but that was
was
rhetorical. That's not even something that's happening on the ground.
That's going to happen. The U.S. earlier promised Turkey that all of its pet YPG, branded as the SDF, would be withdrawn east of the Euphrates, which means in particular Manbij. This is what Erdogan wants. He wants Afrin, the Drablus corridor, which he already has, and Manbij to form his new chunk of the Neo-Ottoman Empire. In fact, he referred to giving the U.S. an Ottoman slap, which if you actually look it up in the Urban Dictionary, you'll find it actually is an indication of complete ineffectualness. At least the way we use the term.
On that very insightful note, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. This is the end of our broadcast segment. Stay with us for our extended version on our YouTube channel. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.